This is a brief overview of plants. Some of the key features that plants have are that they undergo photosynthesis, take light energy from the sun, and convert that light energy along with water and carbon dioxide into carbohydrates and other foods, as well as oxygen. Very similar to humans, multicellular embryos of a plant are grown inside of the plant parent, and they receive nutrients from the plant parent. And plants have an alternation of generations, which means that there is a diploid generation that alternates with a haploid generation. Plants definitely impact other organisms. The first way that I want to talk about is the crucial ecological role of plants. Plants make very vital contributions to our food system. All of our food is based on plants. So if you can think about like tomatoes and potatoes and grains and rices, that all of those things either humans eat or you eat something that ate a plant. Plants contribute to the air by producing oxygen. They help to put nutrients into the soil. And also, they help to filter water in land. One of the things that plants do is plants help to maintain the atmosphere because they can take oxygen through the process of photosynthesis and give that to our atmosphere, but then also take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. This would help us to fight climate change. Plants also help to build soil by rooting into the ground. Plants also make materials that feed fungi and prokaryotes and other decomposers, and then the fungi and the prokaryotes are going to take that plant matter, as well as other dead matter, or the waste of other matter, and make it into useful organic matter. This helps to make soil much more fertile, and then plants can actually have a recycling effect and take the nutrients from their dead bodies or the waste of their bodies, and they can then take that from the soil, those nutrients, and help to make more plants. And like I said, the roots of plants also hold the soil together and help to prevent erosion issues or land being washed away. Plants help to keep our ecosystem moist or humid. They can take up and store water from soil and slow the rate at which water escapes into land systems. They also can slow the rate that water runs off of land and floods ecosystems. So the more plants you have in an ecosystem, the more humid the atmosphere is, and the less chance of water runoff and flooding. Plants also give us a lot of necessities and luxuries like shelter, fuel, and medicine. Wood is used to construct the backbones or frames of many kinds of houses. Wood is important to many people in the world for being warm and also for cooking. And coal is the remnants of past organisms or a fossil fuel that plants are a part of. Many medicines and drugs are originally found in and extracted from plants. For example, aspirin, the heart medication digoxin, Taxol, the malaria drug quinine, and painkillers such as morphine and codeine. Humans have also used a lot of plant species for our own reasons inside of our houses to help to not only make them more pleasant to look at, but plants will help to filter toxins from the air inside of your house. And then we use plants just aesthetically in our communities for flowers and lawns, parks, and also things that we like to eat come from plants or drink, coffee, teas, and many of our delicious foods. So I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics of plants, and then we're going to get into some of the classification of plants. So plants are vascular. If we think about the term vascular and what it means, we are vascular. And so vascular, we usually think of the word veins. And what veins do for plants or for us is they help to carry really important materials around our body. Plants' vascular system is a little bit different. And while it is still a support system of tubes, we're going to look more closely at xylem and phloem specifically that do two things. They provide support to the plants, and they also transport really important things like water from the roots all the way up to the leaves, and then the sugars that are produced in photosynthesis from the leaves and the top of the plant all the way down through the body of the plant and into the roots. You can see vascular tissue in leaves when you look at their veins. So let's take a look at the major groupings of plants. There's non-vascular plants, which are typically kind of small, which means that they don't need a large tube system for support, nor for transporting things like water and sugars around their body. All of their cells are in diffusing distance of chlorophyll and of the ground. So they don't need that transport system to take up room in them. Some non-vascular plants include hornworts, liverworts, and mosses. Vascular plants, it's a big group. They include ferns, club mosses, flowers, conifers, and gymnosperms. So let's talk first about a non-vascular plant, the Bryophyta or moss. Moss are typically pretty small, their leaves, so they do not have vascular tissue or veins. Moss are found in very moist areas with a higher amount of humidity because they need to be able to get moisture into their body easily. Usually we'll find them in other places like near streams where it's very moist, ponds, and in forests where there's a canopy and it can create a higher moisture level inside of the canopy. Some have a waterproof coating that helps them also to retain more moisture, meaning that they can't really sweat out their water. And so that allows them to also be found in drier areas such as deserts or growing on rocks. And even in the far north, where it might be more snowy and water isn't readily available all the time because it's frozen, or in southern climates where the humidity might be really, really low because it's just so hot. Mosses of the genus Sphagnum are common in our area in the north region of the world. Accumulations of dead mosses form peat, and peat is often used as a fuel. The ferns, Pteridophyta, that P is not said, so it's a silent P. Ferns usually have kind of broader leaves or wider leaves, and they are vascular plants. So the rest of the plants that I'm going to talk about, they do have veins or vascular tissues. The leaves emerge in little tiny coils, and these little coils are called fiddleheads that start to uncoil, and then the leaves start to grow in size. These are seedless vascular plants. So the way in which they disperse their gametes is in spores. And sometimes, depending on the time of year and also depending on how windy it is or how much it's rained, sometimes you can see patches of those spores on the undersides of the leaves. One of the other things to look for that will give you a clue that something is a fern is that they have hairy stems at the base of the plant. So near the ground, it'll look like they have hairy spider legs coming out. The next group are the Gymnosperms or evergreen trees. These are non-flowering vascular seed plants. So how do they distribute their gametes? They have cones, so their seeds are found in cones. And one of the other things that's characteristic of Gymnosperms is they have very skinny, needle-like leaves. And another thing about them is that typically, as the name evergreen implies, that these plants are always green in color. They don't lose their leaves typically all at once, but they stay green and needle-like. And then sometimes you can see the cones on those trees. And the last group that I'm going to talk about are the Angiosperms, or the flowering plants. These are vascular flowering plants with seeds that produce their offspring in flowers and fruits. There are more than 230,000 species of flowering plants. They have such a broad range. They can be very, very tiny, 3 millimeters in diameter. The duckweed, you often see this floating in ponds of fresh water. All the way up to the largest plant, the eucalyptus tree. It can be, now get this, not 160 feet high, but 160 meters high. Those are huge. So big range there. The major adaptations of angiosperms are flowers, fruits, and leaves, being broad, meaning that you can see their leaves pretty well. There are two classes of angiosperms, or the flowering plants. Depending on how classification is going, sometimes it is referred to, or they are referred to, as the Magnoliophyta or the Angiospermae. There are two groups, the Monocots, the Monoconolitidae, or the Liliopsida, sometimes they're called, or the Dicots, the Dicotyledonidae, or the Magnoliopsida. So let's take a look at the differences between the monocots and the dicots. So first we're going to start with the flowers themselves. The flower parts, if we take a look at them, we can see that the flower parts are in multiples of threes, or in threes themselves on the monocots. So here, if we take a look at this illustration, picture of this lily, we can look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 petals. Also, if we take a look at the male flower parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if we take a look at the female parts, it's really hard to see, but there is a 3-part pollen landing pad there. You can see it's in a part of 3. Now, when we take a look at the dicots, the flower parts are in 4 or 5 or multiples of 4 or 5. So you definitely can see here a lot more in terms of looking at the male flower parts. This one is in 4 sections, and the petals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The leaves of the monocots are smooth, and they often are narrow. And what I mean by parallel veins is that when you take a look at the veins on the plant, you can see all the veins run up and down in the same direction. It means that the veins are all parallel. In the dicots, the leaves are either oval, like this, that's how you may have drawn a leaf when you were a kid, or they are palmate, like the shape of a palm or a hand. And here in the oak leaf, you can see more of a shape like that. And the leaves are net veined, so there's usually one main vein, and the rest of the leaves come out from there. Now, let's say that we don't have any flowers or leaves. We take a look at the vascular tissue. So remember, we're talking about those tubes that run through the body of the plant. And if we cut open the vascular tissue, what we would find is that the monocots here, they are scattered throughout. So little dots throughout. So it would be like if you took the stem and you cut it open and looked down on it, you would see a pattern like that. Now with dicots, they have more of a ring-like pattern. I like to think of it, looks like almost like a pizza, the way you'd cut a pizza or a pie. So there are these triangle shapes in a circular motion in there. The root patterns are different. For monocots, there's a more fibrous root system. The roots are closer and shallow to the surface of the ground. And with the dicots, they run very, very, very deep, 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 deep down and have roots running off all the way down. The roots go down all the way to tap into the water system, and that's why we call it a tap root system. So these are the kind of plants that would be able to come back year after year, because in our area of the world where it gets very cold, all of these roots may likely die off. But if you have roots that go real deep down into the ground, then they're going to survive over the winter, and these perennial plants will come back up every year, as long as some of the roots survive down here. And the last thing I want to talk about is a cotyledon. A cotyledon is a seed leaf. So what that means is that when you take a look at the monocot and the dicot, it's the first leaf that comes off of the seed. In monocots, it's a single leaf. In dicots, they come off in pairs. The cotyledon is used to temporarily store food until true leaves can be formed. Monocots, again, one cotyledon or seed leaf, and dicots have two. The other thing that you can look at is when we take a look at cotyledons is you can look at the seed itself. Seeds of monocots, mono meaning one, have one piece, like a corn kernel. And dicots, their seeds can be split into two, like a peanut or a bean. So let's just review. Monocot flowers are in threes or multiples of threes, and dicots are in fours or fives. The leaves of monocots have smooth edges. They are long and slender, and you can see the parallel veins within. The dicots are either oval or palmate, like the palm of your hand, like finger shaped, right? And they also have one main vein, and the rest of the veins radiate off of there. Net veined, again, one main vein, and the veins radiate off. In monocots, the vascular tissue makes a pattern of scattered dots when you cut the stem and look down on it. And in the dicots, there is a ring-like pattern of triangles. Monocots have a shallow, fibrous root system, and dicots have a long taproot system that goes deep down. So let's talk a little bit about meristematic tissues. In the term meristematic tissues, we have the word stem. One of the things that we know about stem cells is stem cells have the ability to give rise to different kinds of cells. And so, like we have stem cells, plants also have meristematic tissues or meristem cells. The meristem cells have two fundamental differences. You have the original meristem cells, and they give rise to differentiated cells. Some plants may have meristem cells growing throughout their entire life, but also the meristem cells can give rise to differentiated cells. So a meristem cell is like a generic cell. It's undifferentiated. It allows that plant to continuously grow through its entire lifetime. But what about the rest of the plant? There's specialized features on plants also, and those specialized features will give rise to other parts of the plant, which we would call the non-growing parts of the plant, even though these things do grow a bit, but they don't overall contribute to the height of the plant, for example. These differentiated cells have very specialized structures and functions, like flowers for reproduction, leaves for photosynthesis. The location of the meristem cells depends on the type of cell you're looking at. The apical meristems are at the tips, meaning that at the bottom of the roots or in the roots, and at the top of the plant in the shoots. And when we say shoots, we mean the branches or the leaves. This is what would contribute to the growth and height of the plant. It's going to allow it to root better into the ground and grow taller in size. The lateral meristems are side meristems. They may be called cambium and singular and plural cambia. They form cylinders that run up and down the length of the plant. So think about between the roots and the stems, and this is where the growth of the width or girth of the plant takes place. So think about like the trunk of a tree. Vascular tissue is made up of two specialized kinds of tubes, xylem and phloem. The X sounds like a Z. Xylem is very thick. Why is it thick? Well, it has to transport water and also other minerals. Water in chains makes hydrogen bonds between it and can be very strong in chains. And so if you are trying to pull from the roots all the way down, so down here in the roots, and then you're trying to pull water all the way up to the top of the plant, to the leaves, this whole thing of water is kind of like ripping all the way through the plant and up, up, up. And so it could cause a lot of damage unless the cells that it is being transported through, the xylem, have very thick walls. So it allows for some protection of the plant. The phloem, much thinner, and it is going to transport concentrated sugar in a solution as well as other organic molecules that are made from metabolic reactions of sugar into other kinds of organic materials from the top of the plant and dispersed downward. So remember that xylem goes up and phloem goes down. When we take a look at the stem of a plant, there's a lot of specialized features inside. So what's wood made of anyway? Wood is made up of layers and layers of xylem cells. A woody dicot stem has the same aspects of a regular herbaceous stem or a non-woody stem, like a typical flower, but it's got some extra features so that it can make more xylem and thicker. After the bark layer, we're going to work our way in. You see the vascular cambium. Remember that when we're talking about cambium, we're talking about a kind of a lateral meristem. The vascular cambium, it produces new phloem and new xylem cells. Next comes a layer of xylem. Remember again that when we're talking about xylem cells are transporting water from the roots up to the shoots. Since xylem cells are really thick, they do not compact as new layers are laid down. They stay pretty thick, and you can see them. And so when we're looking at the trunk of a tree, you will see rings. And each layer of those rings, they don't get compacted, but they're able to be seen, and it gives you an idea of the age of a tree. Xylem cells are laid down twice per year. One layer is laid down in the spring, and then another layer is laid down in the summer. And so we can tell a little bit about the climate every year depending on how thick the layer of spring xylem cells are, meaning that if you had a really thick layer, you'd have a really rainy spring, and same for the summer. So here, when we're looking at the spring xylem, the early xylem, in comparison to the summer xylem, the late xylem, what we see is that we had a much rainier spring because we have a lot larger xylem cells. So it means that they had to transport a lot more water. In the summer, you can tell the beginning of the summer was very dry and that the xylem cells got bigger as the summer went on. So it looks like there was more rain later in the summer up here. Here, I wanted to compare a little bit of the vein or vascular tissue arrangement of an herbaceous plant in comparison to the woody tree stem that are also dicots. So this one, when we're looking at the herbaceous stem, you can see that, again, you have that ring-like pattern and then the triangles all around. But when you blow up the triangles, one of the things I want to point out is that in the middle here, you've got the vascular cambium, and then on the inside, you've got the xylem cells for water transport, and toward the outside, you've got the phloem, and remember that the phloem is for sugar transport. Now we're going to talk about the leaf. The leaf has a principal function of photosynthesis. Typically, leaves are pretty flat and they grow outward from the stem of a tree. When we look inside a cross-section of a leaf, you're going to see very specific layers. So we have a distinct pattern in this cross-section. So let's take a look at this. We're going to go from the outer layer to the inner layer. So the outer layer, meaning this area here, and the inner layer down here, this is what is called the epidermis, skin, right? So if we know a little bit about our own anatomy, our skin, this is a familiar term with our own skin, so the outer skin of the leaf. The epidermis on the lower end, and sometimes there's a little bit on the higher end, will have stoma. When we're talking about stoma, those are microscopic openings. So you can see down here, the little opening would be the stoma. The stoma is guarded by what are called guard cells. Sorry, let me step back and just mention that the stoma allow for the exchange of gases and allows for carbon dioxide to come into the plant and oxygen to be released by the plant. And they also allow for the release of water if there's excess water in the plant, or when the plant needs to absorb water, which we'll get to. This is a process called transpiration. Water gets pulled from the roots all the way up the plant. A little bit gets released and it keeps pulling from the roots because of the hydrogen bonding of water. So as I mentioned, the stoma are guarded by guard cells. And so this little bit darker area here, this is a guard cell. And the guard cells, they help to regulate the opening of the stoma. So this is pretty cool. You can see here that when the guard cell is swollen, that the stoma here inside is closed. And when the guard cells are not very swollen, the stoma is open. What regulates the opening and closing of the stoma by the guard cells? Well, that's all determined by hormones, as well as the amount of water that a plant has, so that if it is well hydrated, it doesn't need to absorb more water from the roots and release from the shoots here at the guard cells in the stoma. And if it is dehydrated or it needs more water for some reason, then you're going to have hormones that are going to say, hey, you're dehydrated, or just the lack of water is going to open up this stoma. So a variety of them are called stomates. Mostly we have these guard cells in the bottom of the leaf, so that here on top, sometimes you'll have a few on the top, but if you had them all on the top, if it rained, then you could get that plugged up with water and the plant would essentially stop breathing because it wouldn't be able to pull in carbon dioxide and release oxygen if it was plugged up with water. So that's why they're on the bottom of the leaf, which is protected from rain. The epidermis has a layer of wax on it, and that waxy layer is called the cuticle. And that can help the plant to keep water inside of it, depending on where a plant lives in what area of the world. So if we're talking about desert plants, then the cuticle or waxy layer is going to be much thicker because there's a lot of possibility of getting dehydrated there. In between the epidermal layers, these layers in here, you have what are called mesophyll cells. Those mesophyll cells, and you can see there's two different kinds of mesophyll cells, palisade and spongy. Their main job is to be packed with chloroplasts so that you can have photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis going on here. So you see all these little dots. All those little dots are chlorophyll. One of the things that I want you to notice is that the upper layer, the palisade layer, is more tightly packed together. So there's not spaces in between these, right? They're right next to each other. And they're long and columnar, meaning they're long and skinny in shape and right next to each other. Now, that's different than the spongy mesophyll. Down here at the bottom, the spongy mesophyll, there's holes in between them. Why? Is because you need pockets for the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. So around these spongy mesophyll cells, you can have gas exchange happening in all of these little areas that are open in between. And then because there are pores or pockets of air in between them, that's why it's called spongy, like a sponge. You also will see veins. On the bottom surface of a leaf, they are more obvious. So when you flip over a leaf, you'll see them kind of bumping out or sticking out. And that is the vascular bundles. So that's why they're closer to the bottom surface than they are the top epidermal layer. When we're taking a look at a vascular bundles have two kinds of cells. They have their upper cells that are the xylem for the transport of water, and the lower cells, which are the phloem for the transport of sugar solutions, sugar, as well as other organic molecules. So again, here is your illustration, and I want to show you a live picture or a real picture of what the cross-section of a leaf looks like. And you have cuticle layer here. You have your upper epidermis, the columnar cells that are packed with chlorophyll. Those are called your palisade mesophyll. All of these spongy ones down here, these are called your spongy mesophyll. And then you can see a vascular bundle here and here within. The lower layer is the lower epidermis with a layer of wax or cuticle. Roots have distinct functions. The job of the roots is to anchor the plant into the ground so that it doesn't fall over, to absorb water and transport that water upward in the xylem throughout the body of the plant and then all the way up to the leaves. The roots produce some hormones. And then if the phloem transport sugars and other organic solutions downward and minerals and the rest of the plant doesn't need them, then the roots serve as a storage system. This is what roots look like. What we're going to see through the process of biology and looking at different organisms is that when you see branches, so we got a main branch and then you got more branches and more branches and more branches, and then even on, if we blew up this branch and we look closer, you'd see even more little branches. And what we call those is we call those root hairs. These are the root hairs. Even the roots have their own branches on them. And the point of having branch after branch after branch, lots of branching throughout an organism, is to have a greater amount of surface area. And so this is really important because water is going to be absorbed here through the roots. And you want to have a great deal of surface area so that you can absorb lots and lots of water. So speaking of water, let's talk about transpiration. Kind of sounds like perspiration because they're very similar. Transpiration is like the way that a plant sweats. So when a plant needs water, it is going to transpire, or it is going to lose water at its stomates. Remember the guard cell? And then the guard cell has a stomate inside, a stoma, and then it can it can let go of water there. And more water comes up from the roots and the xylem all the way to the guard cells. So like one big chain of water. And most plants, get this, at least 90% of the water that is absorbed by the roots evaporates or transpires out of the leaves. And more transpiration, water loss, means more absorption of water through the roots. So this may give you a little more idea as water is down here. The reason 90% of the water is actually absorbed is all the way up here when we're looking at guard cells with these guard cells each have a stomata here. So these stomates, when they open up and release water, more water gets absorbed all the way up through the plant and released out here, and that is the process of transpiration. In areas where there are lots and lots of plants, like a rainforest, transpiration is very high, and transpiration contributes to precipitation, water coming down out of the clouds and onto the ground. So that as more water is released through transpiration, more water is put into the atmosphere, which makes it rain more. And so having lots and lots of big trees, lots of plants, lots of greenery allows for higher amounts of transpiration and thus higher amounts of rain or precipitation. One tree, a big tree, can release as much as 200 gallons of water a day. Now, what happens when you take away a lot of those plants? You have deforestation. And so when plants are cut down, huge amounts, football fields of rainforest cut down, now it's getting drier and drier and drier. And guess what? If there is less transpiration, there is less precipitation. And so with less precipitation, plants on the ground start to dehydrate, and the whole system then gets affected, because if you don't have enough water for plants to grow, plants die, then what happens to the rest of the organisms there? They're going to leave because there's no food, and or they may die. So the animals, the fungi, the protists, the prokaryotes, they're all going to die or go away. The Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica, you can see that 80%, well, maybe you can't see 80%, but sorry, let me go to the next slide. So here, there's been a ton of deforestation. This is what it used to look like with all the trees present. And you can see there's lots of clouds, right? There's lots of clouds, which means lots of water available, which means a regular rainforest, right? But now in this reserve area where logging is not allowed back here, you see the clouds again. And so with the clouds again, you have a very different atmosphere, very wet here and very dry in this area down here. Flowers have different parts. So we're going to take a look at the structure of a flower. Each of the parts has a specific function. We're going to start down here with the receptacle. So this is the base of the flower. It supports the flower from falling over. You have green petals, you know, like a flower bud. Those green petals, those are called the sepals, and the petals are enclosed inside of the sepals until the flower starts to blossom. Flower petals come in a really wide variety of colors, shapes, sizes, and even scents. We know that some flowers smell really good, some flowers not so good. There's actually a flower that smells like rotting flesh, and it attracts specific kinds of pollinators. The idea of a pollinator is to help to, on the stamen or the male flower part, it has pollen or gametes on it. They are going to go from plant to plant. They're going to eat some of the sugar that comes up here out of the carpel. They're going to get the get the pollen on their body, and then when they go to another plant, another flower over here, they're going to transport some of that pollen onto this plant, and they're going to help pollinate this plant. The male portion of the flower is called the stamen. So here you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamens. So this should give you the idea that this is a monocot because the male flower parts are in groups of 3. It's not just the petals, but also the male and female flower parts. So the male stamen is made up of two parts, the anther, which has the pollen on it, and it has the filaments, or the long skinny stalk, from which the anthers come out of. So you would see little like dot, 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 dots on here, and this would be the pollen that's on the anthers. So this, if you think about a flower, this particular flower, it essentially has, if we compared it to a human, 6 penises. So now we're going to take a look at the female flower part, the carpel. The carpel is made up of 3 parts. Carpels are also known as pistils, pistil or carpel. And the pistil or carpel has 3 major parts on this. 3 major parts in general. I'll get to the other thought I was going with. The 3 major parts are the stigma, which is what we call the pollen landing pad. And you have the style, which is this long skinny part here. And the ovary, like humans again, they have ovaries like we do. So they have 1 ovary. Most females have 2 ovaries. Inside of the ovaries, you can see these little circles. These are the eggs. Now at the top here, you have the pollen landing pad, which is called the stigma. And if we look down on it for this particular flower, what we would see is that the shape of it would be like this. So it would have 1, 2, 3 arms to it, or branches, and that also contributes to the idea that this flower that we're looking at here is a monocot, flower parts in groups of 3. So even the carpel is in a group of 3. Usually what happens is that sugars will get transported up here and become sticky. We might call it nectar. And that's what attracts pollinators like birds, bees, other insects, bats, to come and take little drinks or licks of that nectar. And when they do that, some of the pollen that they carried from other flowers would get stuck onto this. And that's why it's called the pollen landing pad, because it gets stuck in that sticky, sugary stuff. And then it's kind of interesting is that part of the pollen's job is to digest its way downward. And the pollen has the sperm inside, so that the sperm can meet up with the egg inside of the ovary. So again, just remembering, we can look at different parts of the flower to determine whether we are talking about a monocot or a dicot. And so this is just showing 1, 2, 3 petals. That would give us the idea of this has 3 petals. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamens, male flower parts. And in the carpel, as I told you, the top of the carpel would look, the stigma would look like that, so that it has 1, 2, 3 parts to it. And so what we know is that this particular flower would then be classified as a monocot. And here you can see a lily again, the stamen, the anthers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the stigma, it's kind of covered up, but it would be 1, 2, 3 parts. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 petals. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between flower, fruits, and seeds. The flower, it is the reproductive structure of the plant. So the flower is going to attract its pollinators, which we'll get to in just a second. I'll remind you a little bit more about them. From the flower, if the eggs and the ovary, for an egg and an ovary is fertilized by the sperm in the pollen, then you could grow fruit. Inside of the fruit are the seeds, and the seeds contain the offspring or the embryos. Seeds have an embryonic plant, so that's why we plant seeds to grow a new plant, because the process of pollination and fertilization has occurred. Now, I think this is interesting. Here is where fertilization occurs in the ovary of the flower, and then from there grows the fruit. Here's a seed, like a peach pit is the seed. And if you planted that peach pit, inside of it, the embryo could grow into a peach tree if it's taken care of. But what's all this? This is the fruit. Guess what fruit is? That yummy, delicious peach, the watermelon, the strawberry. The fruit flesh is an ovary. Yep, so when you are biting into an apple, a peach, just think you're eating the ovary of another organism. If you eat strawberries, the seeds on the strawberry that you eat, you're just eating a whole bunch of babies or embryos. And think about sometimes like a peach pit, what do? You just throw it away. You've just thrown away another organism and their potential to become a full-fledged organism, or to grow into the full-fledged organism. So let's go back to pollination. Pollination is when the pollen of one plant is brought to another one. You have to have pollination in order for fertilization to occur. Pollination just refers to pollen landing on the pollen landing pad, the stigma. So remember, from our lily, the top part with its three, it would go down and then go down into our ovary, and your ovary has the eggs inside. And so the pollen would have to digest its way all the way down and through. There's a lot of different routes to pollination. It could be the wind just blows and pollen lands on a different flower. Insects, bats, birds, bees, all of those can bring the pollen from one plant to another. Sometimes water can transport it. And, sorry, I'm going fast. The last thing that I want to talk about are hormones that plants have. So I know I mentioned that before, that the roots have hormones in them. And all living things, or well, I should say not all living things, but most living things have hormones. And hormones are just chemical messengers. And they tell one cell to do something else. So let's talk about 3 different hormones that plants have. One, they have auxins. Auxins have a few different jobs. One is phototropism. If you have a plant and it's near a window, what happens to that plant is the plant starts to lean toward the sun. That's phototropism. Plants grow upward because of phototropism. They grow toward the sun. Apical dominance, what that means with the plant is that when you have a plant and then there's a little bud here in between the top 2 leaves, if you cut this off, it'll stop growing upward and it'll start to grow outward and get bushier. If you leave that intact, then the plant's going to continue to grow upward. And then it also, auxins help with root branching, as well as elongation of the cells, another way that makes the plant grow taller. Some hormones are going to have overlapping jobs. Gibberellins, they stimulate seed germination. Remember, we're doing a lab in which we are utilizing gibberellins on our pea plants. So one of the pieces of data that we're going to be looking at is how many seeds germinate. We have some dwarf pea plants that do not produce gibberellins naturally, and so they're not going to have as easy of a time germinating. And when we mean germination, we mean emergence or breaking from the seed to grow the plant. So how many seeds sprout? That's one piece of data you're going to be looking at. Fruit development. We're not going to get that far in our experiment. We won't see if more peas are made by these pea plants. And the last thing is cell division and elongation, very similar to what happens in auxins. Here's another way that plants are going to grow in height. And so we're going to look at two pieces of data when we're looking at our pea plants. We're going to look at how tall or long they grow, and we're going to look at how well the seeds sprout. So these are our two pieces of data. Oftentimes students forget about this one, but gibberellins do all three of these things. And then the last hormone that I want to talk about is ethylene. Ethylene is made in greater quantities as plants ripen. So that means, for example, like bananas, this commonly happens, that if you have bananas and you forget to eat them and they start turning from green to yellow to brown, that means they're going through the ripening. And as they go from green to yellow to brown, they're producing increased amount of ethylene. And what the ethylene does is that when you have the ethylene of one piece of fruit, it will promote further ripening of other fruits around it. So if you wanted to make banana bread, and banana bread's much better when you have brown bananas that are really ripened and very sugary and yummy tasting, like in that way, and squishy, that let's say you got a new thing of bananas, you only have one banana left, and you're like, oh, I gotta go to the store and get more bananas, but I wanna make banana bread today. Maybe you can't do it today, but if you took the bananas that are new and put them in a paper bag in an enclosed situation with that black banana is going to give off ethylene, and it's going to help the other new bananas to ripen much faster. So you also want to separate any ripened fruit from each other, otherwise it'll just promote faster ripening.